The leather gardening gloves lay on the potting bench that morning, their palms stained dark from years of working spring soil. One thumb had been mended with brown thread, clumsy stitches that puckered the seam but held. The repair job had taken him nearly an hour at the kitchen table one evening the previous fall, squinting in the lamplight as he threaded the needle again and again, muttering about his deteriorating eyesight and stubborn refusal to admit he needed reading glasses. His wife had offered to do it for him, but he'd waved her off with gentle insistence, determined to finish what he'd started even if the result looked more like patchwork than proper mending. The morning of his disappearance started the way most Saturdays did in their subdivision on the outskirts of town, with sprinkler heads ticking across lawns in rhythmic percussion, and the smell of cut grass drifting through screened windows that had been opened to catch the first genuinely warm air of the season. It was early June in 1988, the kind of morning where humidity hung soft in the air without yet becoming oppressive, where cardinals called from oak branches and neighbors emerged in weekend clothes to tackle yard work postponed through a wet spring. The man who would vanish before sunset was 63 years old, retired from the Postal Service for 18 months, and had spent that morning trimming back the climbing roses along the back fence, pruning carefully to encourage new growth while preserving the structure he'd trained over 5 patient years. His wife had heard him whistling something tuneless as he worked, not a recognizable melody, just the absent-minded musical accompaniment of someone content in their task. She remembered that detail later, turning it over in her mind during the months and years that followed, examining it from every angle the way you might study a photograph for clues you'd missed on first viewing. How ordinary the sound had been. How easy to dismiss as background noise in the texture of a Saturday morning. How impossible to know that ordinary sounds could become relics, preserved in memory with archaeological precision because they were the last evidence of normalcy before everything fractured. He had come inside around 10:30. Boots leaving faint grass clippings on the kitchen linoleum despite his habit of stomping them off on the back step. He poured himself a glass of water from the tap, drank it standing at the sink while looking out at the yard he'd just been working, and told her he was driving to the hardware store for fence staples and maybe some fertilizer if they had the brand he preferred. The truck keys jingled as he lifted them from the brass hook by the door. The same hook that had held those keys for 12 years, since they'd moved into this house with its quarter-acre lot and mature trees, and the kind of quiet that had seemed like luxury after decades of apartment living with thin walls and neighboring arguments bleeding through. She told him to pick up bread if he remembered. He said he would, smiling at her the way he always did when she added grocery items to hardware runs, an expression of patient amusement that had become their private shorthand for domestic routine. The screen door slapped shut behind him with its characteristic whack, the spring stretched just loose enough to make that sound rather than the sharper crack it had made when new. She heard his footsteps on the concrete path, heard the truck door open and close, heard the engine turn over and settle into its familiar rumble before pulling away down the street. That was the last time anyone in the household saw him step out into the daylight, wearing a faded plaid shirt, red and brown checks, worn soft from countless washings, and those mended gloves tucked into his back pocket where he always carried them, a habit from Postal Service years when efficiency meant keeping tools immediately accessible. Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, the ones where ordinary life cracks open and decades pass before the pieces realign in configurations no one could have predicted, consider subscribing. These narratives matter not just for their drama, but for what they reveal about the fragility of identity, the persistence of hope, and the strange mercy of second chances that arrive too late to undo damage but early enough to rewrite endings. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Geography matters in these cases more than you might think, and we're always curious about the community listening to these stories unfold across time zones and continents, connected by the universal terror of someone simply not coming home. The hardware store sat 3 miles away, on a 2-lane road flanked by farmland, where corn was just beginning to show green in straight rows, and the occasional roadside stand, selling early tomatoes and the first strawberries of the season. It was the kind of route he'd driven hundreds of times, familiar to the point of automation, past the white church with the tall steeple, the abandoned gas stations someone kept meaning to renovate, the creek that flooded every few years and left mud across the asphalt in thick ribbons that took weeks to fully wash away. Employees working that Saturday would later confirm they never saw him. Security footage, grainy and time-stamped with white numbers that bled into the background, showed no sign of his truck in the lot. The bread never made it home. Neither did the fence staples. Neither did the man who'd left whistling. By late afternoon, his wife began to feel the first flutter of unease. Nothing concrete, just an awareness that the errand had stretched longer than it should, that the truck hadn't returned to its spot in the driveway, that the day was moving forward without him in it. She told herself he'd run into someone he knew, gotten talking the way men do in hardware store aisles, comparing brands and swapping stories about projects. Or maybe he'd decided to stop for lunch, treat himself to the diner across town that served the kind of greasy burger he pretended not to love when she cooked healthier meals at home. She occupied herself with laundry, with weeding the front flower bed, with small tasks that kept her hands busy, while her mind tracked time with increasing precision. By evening, when shadows stretched long across the yard and the air cooled, and the whistling from the morning felt like something from another era entirely, she called their eldest son, who lived 2 towns over with his young family in a split-level ranch they'd bought the previous year. She tried to keep her voice measured, not wanting to alarm him over what might still be nothing, but he heard the tension underneath and said he'd drive over. While she waited, she walked through the house looking for signs she might have missed. A note left on the counter, a change of clothes missing from the closet, anything that might suggest a plan she hadn't been told about. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the one thing that wasn't. He was simply gone. The son arrived just after 7, still wearing his weekend yard work clothes, and immediately began checking the usual places. The VFW hall where his father sometimes met friends for cards on Saturday nights, closed, empty, no one there. The diner where he liked coffee and pie, waitress shook her head, hadn't seen him all day. The park 3 blocks over where he fed ducks on warm afternoons, carrying stale bread in paper bags, and standing at the pond's edge while mallards paddled close, deserted except for a young couple pushing a stroller and a teenager throwing a tennis ball for a retriever. No one had seen him. No one remembered the truck. It was as though he'd driven into empty air and simply dissolved. By 9 that night, with darkness settled and porch lights glowing up and down the street, the local sheriff's office took the missing person report. A deputy with tired eyes and 20 years on the force filled out the form in methodical handwriting, asking questions in a calm voice designed to extract facts without amplifying panic. Height, weight, distinguishing marks, what he'd been wearing, the make and model of the truck, license plate number, medical conditions, medications, state of mind when last seen. His wife provided answers as precisely as she could, her voice steady through training that came from decades of managing crisis without falling apart, though her hands twisted a dish towel in her lap throughout the interview. She mentioned the gloves left behind on the potting bench. How unusual it was, because he always carried them when he went for supplies, always had them tucked in his pocket or hooked through a belt loop. The deputy nodded, made a note, and promised they'd start looking right away. Search protocols in 1988 moved slower than they do now, relying on radio dispatches to patrol cars and phone trees to neighboring jurisdictions instead of digital alerts that could flood hundreds of devices in seconds. But by dawn the next morning, patrol units across 3 counties had descriptions of both the man and his vehicle. Officers briefed during shift changes, copies of the missing person report distributed to departments that shared borders, and information in overlapping territories. The truck turned up 4 days later in a rest area parking lot 60 miles north, tucked between 2 tractor trailers on the far edge of the asphalt where vehicles often parked for extended periods without drawing attention. A state trooper doing a routine check noticed it had been there more than 24 hours. He remembered seeing it the previous day, and ran the plates. The registration came back attached to a missing person case. He approached carefully, hand near his service weapon out of habit, peering through windows before determining the vehicle was unoccupied. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position, but not removed. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder, cap still on, condensation long since evaporated. A receipt from a gas station, time-stamped 2:15 on the afternoon of his disappearance, lay crumpled on the passenger seat, showing a fuel purchase and a pack of gum. The truck's interior was otherwise unremarkable. A map folded in the door pocket, a tire pressure gauge in the glove compartment, a fleece jacket draped across the back seat. No signs of struggle, no blood, no note, no evidence of anything except an ordinary vehicle whose driver had simply stepped away and never returned. The scene felt suspended, preserved like something under glass, as though he'd intended to come back in 5 minutes, and those 5 minutes had stretched into days, while the truck waited patiently for purpose that never arrived. A canine unit was dispatched within hours, German shepherds trained in search and rescue work that could distinguish between living and deceased scents, that could track footprints invisible to human eyes across considerable distances. They swept the surrounding woods in methodical grids, officers walking in careful lines while dogs worked the ground, noses down, moving through underbrush and across open fields that bordered the rest area on 3 sides. They found nothing. No trail leading away from the parking lot. No scent that continued beyond the immediate vicinity of the truck. No evidence he'd walked into the woods or collapsed in the tall grass or met with foul play in any of the forms investigators had learned to recognize. The truck was towed back to the county impound, photographed from every angle, dusted for prints that matched only family members whose presence made sense. His wife, who occasionally rode with him, his son, who'd borrowed it once when his own vehicle was in the shop. Eventually, it was returned to the driveway where it would sit under a tarp for years, a monument to absence. The search mobilized in concentric circles, radiating outward from the rest area in patterns designed to cover maximum territory with limited resources. Volunteers from neighboring churches and civic groups assembled in the high school parking lot on a humid Sunday morning, dividing into teams with topographical maps photocopied and distributed, walkie-talkies tested and assigned to team leaders, water bottles and first aid kits loaded into vehicles. They combed ditches running alongside country roads where visibility dropped to 0 if you weren't specifically looking. They knocked on farmhouse doors, speaking to families who'd lived there for generations and knew every acre of their land, asking if anyone had seen a man walking alone, looking lost or injured or confused. They checked abandoned barns where weather and time had collapsed roofs and left structures barely standing, places where someone seeking shelter might crawl and then become trapped. They searched equipment sheds filled with decades of accumulated machinery, calling his name into dim interiors that smelled of motor oil and rust. They walked fence lines and tree breaks and the edges of ponds where someone might have stumbled and fallen. For 3 consecutive weekends, volunteers gave up their time to look for a man they mostly didn't know, driven by the community impulse that says when one of us is lost, all of us are responsible for the search. Flyers went up on telephone poles and bulletin boards across 4 counties. His photograph, taken at a retirement party the previous year, showing him in a suit he'd worn uncomfortably, smiling with genuine happiness despite hating to dress up, staring out from beneath the word missing in bold block letters. The flyers listed his physical description, what he'd been wearing, the circumstances of his disappearance, and a phone number to call with information. They fluttered on community center walls and grocery store entrances and gas station windows, gradually fading in sunlight and curling at the edges from humidity until they became background wallpaper that people stopped really seeing. Local newspapers ran the story on inside pages, a few hundred words summarizing the facts with a request for public assistance. A regional television station did a 2-minute segment on the evening news, showing footage of searchers walking through fields, and an interview with his son asking anyone who'd seen anything to please come forward. Tips trickled in through the phone line that had been set up specifically for the case, each one requiring follow-up investigation, cross-referencing, verification. One witness claimed to have seen a man matching his description at a bus station 3 towns east, purchasing a ticket for a destination she couldn't remember. When investigators followed up, reviewing station records and interviewing staff, the timeline didn't align. The sighting had occurred 2 days before his disappearance, and the physical details were off by 20 pounds and several inches. Another caller insisted she'd spotted him boarding a Greyhound headed for the state capitol, absolutely certain because she'd made eye contact and he'd looked troubled. But passenger manifests pulled through company cooperation showed no one matching his description, and station security footage from the relevant time period revealed nothing. A trucker phoned in to report picking up a hitchhiker near the rest area the day after the disappearance, a man who'd seemed disoriented and reluctant to talk. The trucker had dropped him at a truck stop 40 miles down the highway and hadn't thought much of it until seeing the news coverage. Investigators drove to the truck stop, interviewed staff, reviewed what limited security footage existed, and came up empty. The man the trucker described wore a leather jacket in June heat and spoke with a noticeable accent that didn't match the missing man's flat Midwestern voice. Each lead required hours of work, phone calls, interviews, driving to remote locations to verify stories that fell apart under examination. Each one unraveled into dead ends that felt like small defeats accumulating into insurmountable weight. The emotional architecture of his household began to shift in ways both small and seismic. The structure of daily life reorganizing itself around the absence at its center. His wife kept the gardening gloves on the potting bench, where he'd left them that Saturday morning, unable to put them away, but unable to look at them without something tightening in her chest. A physical response to the object permanence of things that outlasted the people who'd shaped them. She maintained routines as a form of resistance against chaos, watering the roses he'd pruned, though they grew wild without his attention. Setting the table for two out of habit born from 40 years of marriage, then catching herself and clearing one side away. Sleeping on her side of the bed and leaving his untouched, sheets smooth and pillows undisturbed. Their children took turns visiting, rearranging work schedules and childcare to ensure she wasn't alone too many nights in a row. They sat with her in the living room where the television played low, background noise against silence, and conversations circled the same questions without ever finding answers that satisfied. What had happened at the rest area? Had he met someone? Had he gotten confused, suffered some medical episode that affected his thinking? Had he chosen to leave? That last question sat heaviest, unspoken most of the time but present in every conversation subtext. The possibility that disappearance had been voluntary, that he'd decided the life he'd built wasn't worth continuing. Holidays became exercises in pretending normalcy could be salvaged from absence. The first Thanksgiving, 4 months after he vanished, they gathered as planned because canceling felt like giving up. They set a place for him anyway. An empty chair at the head of the table that everyone avoided looking at directly while serving themselves turkey and passing dishes with determined cheerfulness. By Christmas, they'd stopped setting the place, but the gap where he should have been remained obvious. In the stockings hung on the mantel that numbered one fewer. In the gifts wrapped and exchanged without his presence to anchor the ritual. In the forced quality of conversations that worked too hard to avoid mentioning him, and therefore made his absence more pronounced. Financially, the strain manifested in silent ways that compounded over months. Retirement savings had been modest but sufficient for 2 people living simply, planned around conservative estimates of longevity, structured to provide steady income supplemented by Social Security and his postal pension. Now stretched across one person while simultaneously accommodating the costs of a search that never truly ended. The calculations no longer balanced in comfortable ways. Private investigators consulted in the early months charged hourly rates that accumulated faster than results. Travel expenses for chasing leads across state lines, gas, occasional hotel rooms, meals eaten in unfamiliar towns, added up. Legal fees for navigating the murky territory of a missing person who might be deceased but couldn't be declared so. Without proof required consultations with attorneys who specialized in liminal categories that didn't fit standard procedures. His pension continued at least, which helped maintain the mortgage and utilities and basic living expenses. But the limbo of not knowing whether to grieve or hope created a peculiar paralysis around financial decisions. Do you maintain 2 health insurance policies indefinitely on the chance he might need coverage if found? Do you eventually move forward as though he died, settling the estate and redistributing assets? These were questions without guidebooks in 1988. Before support groups and online forums created communities of people navigating similar nightmares who could offer hard-won advice about the bureaucratic realities of disappearance. Their community, a tight-knit cluster of families who'd watched each other's children grow through school years, borrowed lawnmowers across property lines, and gathered for block parties on summer weekends, responded initially with the full force of collective concern. Casseroles appeared on the porch, offered with sympathetic expressions and assurances to call if anything was needed. Neighbors took turns mowing the lawn, maintaining the garden he'd tended so carefully, ensuring the external appearances of normal life continued even as internal structures crumbled. But as weeks turned to months and the urgency of crisis faded into chronic uncertainty, the collective attention inevitably shifted. People had their own lives to manage, their own crises to navigate. Sympathy couldn't sustain itself indefinitely at fever pitch without exhausting itself and everyone involved. His wife found herself navigating a particular kind of loneliness that had no good name, visible but not quite a widow, surrounded by concern that gradually, politely, receded into the background hum of daily life. Conversations with neighbors became shorter, more surface. People stopped asking if there was news because they could see from her face there wasn't, and asking just reinforced what everyone wanted to forget. She attended church on Sundays and sat in the same pew where they'd sat together, alone now, singing hymns and listening to sermons about faith and endurance that felt both comforting and hollow. She smiled when people greeted her, said she was fine when they asked, and went home to a house that echoed. The procedural mechanisms grinding behind the scenes worked in slow, methodical increments that measured time in bureaucratic units rather than emotional ones. Detectives cross-referenced his name against hospital admission records across multiple states, looking for John Doe's brought in unconscious or confused unidentified patients who matched his description, any indication he'd sought or received medical care. They checked morgue intakes, the grim database of bodies found and awaiting identification, comparing dental records against remains logged in every county within a 5-state radius. They monitored credit card activity that showed nothing after the gas station charge, time-stamped the afternoon of his disappearance. No withdrawals, no purchases, no paper trail suggesting ongoing existence in the systems that tracked modern life. His social security number triggered no hits in databases designed to catch exactly these patterns. No employment records that would generate tax paperwork, no new address registrations logged with postal services, no interactions with government agencies that would create documentation. For someone to disappear so completely in the modern era required either deliberate effort to stay off-grid or something catastrophic that prevented interaction with any system that might generate records. Neither explanation felt satisfying. The deliberate option required sustained intention that seemed incompatible with everything his family knew about him. The catastrophic option should have produced evidence. Remains, hospital admission, some physical trace indicating finality. One detective assigned to the case, a soft-spoken man in his mid-40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of doodling intricate geometric patterns in the margins of his notes during interviews, approached the investigation with a theory he kept mostly to himself. He believed the rest area represented a decision point, a place where someone might voluntarily step away from their life, using public transportation or hitchhiking to create distance quickly while abandoning the vehicle that could be traced. He'd seen similar patterns before, though rarely with retirees. Usually middle-aged men wrestling with debts that had compounded beyond management, or affairs that threatened to detonate families, or quiet desperation that had accumulated over decades into unbearable weight. But this man didn't fit those profiles in any obvious way. Finances were stable if unspectacular. No evidence of relationships outside his marriage. By all accounts, he'd seemed content in retirement, loved his garden, talked about it constantly with neighbors and family, doted on grandchildren, showing up reliably for school events and birthday parties with wrapped presents selected carefully. Had plans to drive cross-country with his wife the following summer, maps already collected and routes marked in highlighter. The detective couldn't make the voluntary disappearance angle fit snugly with the life the man had been living. But he couldn't dismiss it either, because sometimes people contained vast interior landscapes that never showed on surfaces, and desperation operated according to private logic that made sense only to the person experiencing it. By the time 1989 arrived, the active search had cooled from its initial intensity to a simmer that would continue indefinitely, but without consuming daily attention from everyone involved. His case file remained open, updated periodically when a new tip came in through channels that remained active even as immediate urgency faded. Database cross-checks ran automatically now, his information lodged in systems that would flag any match against hospital admissions, arrests, unidentified remains. But the daily grind of following leads, interviewing witnesses, organizing physical searches through terrain already covered multiple times, that work had ebbed into background operation rather than foreground mission. His wife attended a support group for families of missing persons, meetings held Tuesday evenings in the basement of a Methodist church on the other side of town, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and weak coffee offered in styrofoam cups. She listened to other stories of vanished husbands, runaway teenagers who'd severed contact completely, estranged siblings who'd walked away from families without explanation or forwarding addresses. Some members of the group found comfort in shared experience, in the validation of hearing their own pain reflected in others' narratives. Others, like her, found it amplified the helplessness. Hearing story after story without resolution made disappearance seem less exceptional and somehow more terrible for its commonness, as though people evaporated regularly and the world just continued spinning regardless. Years folded into each other with a sameness that felt both numbing and exhausting. Time measured not in individual days, but in seasons that repeated without variation or development. The roses he'd pruned that last Saturday morning grew wild, canes shooting up beyond the fence line and blooming with abandon. A neighbor trimmed them back one summer out of kindness, trying to maintain order. Then they grew wild again. Eventually his wife stopped caring about roses. His grandchildren aged through elementary school, middle school, high school, graduations that should have included him but occurred in his absence. They asked fewer questions as time passed, learning that certain subjects made the adults around them retreat into strained silences, that curiosity could wound even when well-intentioned. Photographs of him remained on walls and mantels throughout the family, his smile frozen in moments before everything fractured. Birthday parties, holidays, casual weekend snapshots taken without knowing they'd become precious documentation of someone lost. His image aged in reverse, growing younger as the people around him aged forward, until the man in the photographs bore less resemblance to the person they remembered, and more to an artifact from another era entirely. Technology advanced in increments that gradually reshaped investigative possibilities. By the mid-1990s, databases that had been siloed across jurisdictions, each state, sometimes each county maintaining separate records without easy ways to cross-reference, began linking together through networks that allowed broader searches. The National Crime Information Center expanded its missing person entries, creating standardized formats that improved matches between cases. DNA analysis, once reserved for only the most high-profile cases and requiring extensive lab work that took months, became more accessible and faster, though still not routine for missing persons, without strong evidence suggesting foul play. In 1997, nearly a decade after his disappearance, a cold case unit formed in the county with funding from a federal grant designed to address unsolved investigations. The unit consisted of 3 detectives pulled from other assignments, given office space in a building separate from active operations, and tasked with reviewing files that had gone dormant. His case was pulled from the archive, a manila folder grown thick with reports and interview transcripts and search records accumulated over years. Fresh eyes sometimes caught what familiarity missed, patterns invisible to investigators who'd been immersed in details from the beginning. They contacted his wife, now 73, and living with her daughter across town in a smaller house after selling the original home in a decision that had been agonizing but necessary. The memories attached to every room had become unbearable. Presence in absence, his voice echoing in empty space. She'd downsized to a 2-bedroom ranch with a manageable yard and no potting bench. The detective who called explained what they were doing and asked if she'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for entry into databases that hadn't existed back in 1988. She agreed immediately, desperate for anything that might finally provide answers. The DNA sample, collected with a cheek swab at the local police station, labeled and logged with identification numbers that would track it through analysis, was entered into the state database and cross-referenced against unidentified remains. No matches surfaced. The detectives requested dental records, which had been submitted during the original investigation, but could now be digitally scanned and compared against a wider network of cases, through systems that linked coroner offices across multiple states. Again, nothing. The case went back into the file cabinet with a new notation. Active review. Pending technological cross-reference. A bureaucratic phrase that meant they weren't giving up, but had run out of active steps to pursue. The turn came in 2003. 15 years after he'd walked out the door in a plaid shirt with mended gloves in his pocket. A lifetime, and also no time at all, depending on perspective. A social worker in a city 4 states west, a sprawling metropolitan area he'd had no known connection to, was processing intake paperwork for a municipal shelter system that served several hundred people nightly. The shelter operated on the compassionate exhaustion typical of underfunded social services, staff doing their best with insufficient resources while navigating the complex needs of populations experiencing homelessness, mental health crises, addiction, and the 1,000 overlapping factors that brought people to emergency housing. She noticed an elderly man who'd been residing there on and off for several months, reliable in his presence but mysterious in his background. He was polite in that old-fashioned way that stood out in environments where trauma often manifested as defensive rudeness. Soft-spoken, never demanding, seemingly content to spend his days reading donated newspapers in the common area and helping sort clothing donations without being asked. A volunteer in everything but official designation. He never caused trouble. Never asked for much beyond meals and a bed. Never participated in the drama that sometimes erupted between residents. But something about him nagged at her, a quality she couldn't quite name, a sense that his presence there didn't align with the typical trajectories that brought people into shelter systems. Most residents had histories she could reconstruct from fragments, addiction that had cost them housing, mental health crises that had severed family connections, financial catastrophes that had cascaded beyond recovery. This man didn't fit those patterns. He seemed healthy, cognitively intact, capable of functioning independently. Yet here he was, night after night, sleeping in a room shared with 11 other men and showing no signs of moving toward the transitional housing programs designed to help people exit shelter systems. The disconnection troubled her professional instincts. During a routine conversation in the shelter's courtyard, a small concrete space with a few planters and a bench where residents could sit outside, she asked where he was from. He said he wasn't sure. The answer delivered without apparent distress, just matter-of-fact uncertainty. She asked if he had family anywhere. He said he thought so, but the details were vague, edges of memory or imagination that didn't cohere into specific names or places. She asked what he'd done before coming to the shelter, trying to piece together even basic biographical information. He said he'd moved around, worked when he could find it, didn't remember exactly how long or where. She asked his name, and he provided one that sounded almost generic, unremarkable enough to blend into any population without drawing attention. She'd worked in social services long enough, 17 years across 3 different agencies, to recognize cognitive impairment or trauma-induced dissociation when she encountered it. This felt like the latter, not confusion born of dementia or degenerative disease, but something more profound, a disconnection from identity that seemed either purposeful or protective. His affect was calm, his answers considered rather than rushed, but content remained perpetually just out of reach. Like talking to someone through frosted glass, shapes visible but features obscured. She filed a wellness check request with the city's liaison program for unsheltered individuals, a team that included medical professionals, mental health counselors, and case managers who tried to connect vulnerable people with appropriate services. The wellness check triggered a cursory background search, standard procedure to determine if someone had outstanding warrants, existing case files, or documentation trails that might inform service provision. His name pulled up nothing. No criminal record in any system they checked. No prior social service interactions logged anywhere. No documentation suggesting he existed in databases that tracked modern American life. That absence itself became a red flag more pronounced than any positive hit might have been. In contemporary America, everyone generated records from the moment of birth. Social security numbers, school enrollment, driver's licenses, tax filings, medical visits, utility accounts, credit cards, employment history. To have none of these suggested either recent immigration without documentation, a deliberately obscured past maintained through careful effort, or someone who'd been living entirely off-grid for an extended period. The liaison worker, intrigued and concerned, dug deeper through channels that required more effort and authorization. She requested fingerprints through a voluntary consent process, carefully framed as helping him access potential benefits, rather than investigation or surveillance. He agreed readily, untroubled by the request, allowing his prints to be taken with professional equipment at a city office. The prints were run through the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS, a database that by 2003 contained over 47 million sets of prints from civilian and law enforcement sources, capable of conducting searches and identifying matches within hours, where similar work had once taken weeks or months if it happened at all. The match came back within 72 hours. Results delivered through secure channels to the liaison worker who'd submitted the request. A name from a missing person case filed in 1988. A detailed record of a man who'd vanished from a hardware store errand in a state halfway across the country, who'd left behind a truck at a rest area, and a wife who'd spent 15 years in limbo between hope and grief. The fingerprints were unmistakable, ridges and whorls matching with the certainty that made prints reliable for exactly this purpose. The John Doe living in the municipal shelter, sorting donated clothes and reading yesterday's news, wasn't anonymous at all. He was someone's father, someone's husband, someone who'd been searched for across years and jurisdictions and emotional landscapes too vast to adequately map. The detective who received the notification, a woman in her early 30s who'd joined the force years after the original case had gone cold, for whom this represented history rather than lived experience, pulled the file with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She read through 2 decades of accumulated notes, seeing the investigation unfold in reverse, working backward from dormancy to the intense activity of those first days and weeks. She saw the descriptions, the photographs, the documented searches, the false leads that had consumed hours of work before dissolving into nothing. She saw periodic check-ins with family members, notes tracking their movements and contact information as they aged and relocated. The notations grew less frequent over time, eventually tapering to annual reviews required by policy but not producing new action. She saw the name of his wife, now elderly herself, and understood this notification would require the most delicate handling imaginable. 15 years was long enough for people to rebuild entire lives around absence, to create equilibrium even in grief's presence, to establish new normal that accommodated loss. Disrupting that equilibrium carried risks, reopening wounds that had scarred over, introducing chaos into stability purchased at tremendous emotional cost, forcing people to reckon with a return they might have stopped preparing for years ago. This required careful orchestration, consultation with superiors, probably involvement from mental health professionals who specialized in trauma and reunion dynamics. Before contacting family, she flew out to meet him personally, needing to see with her own eyes that the match was real, and to assess his condition before setting complex machinery in motion. The shelter staff, briefed on the situation's sensitivity, moved him to a private room typically reserved for medical isolation. A small space with a bed, a chair, a window that looked out on an alley. More dignity than the open dormitory floors where most residents slept. When she entered, he stood politely, a gesture from another era suggesting mannerly conditioning that had survived whatever had disrupted everything else. She studied his face across the small room, comparing it mentally to photographs she'd memorized from the file. Older, certainly. 15 years etched into skin that had weathered significant sun exposure, suggesting time spent outdoors. Hair gone entirely white, receded further back than in the photographs. Posture slightly stooped where he'd stood straight before. But the bone structure matched, the set of his eyes, the shape of his hands. She introduced herself, explained she was investigating a case from many years ago, and asked if she could talk with him. He agreed, settling into the chair and waiting with patient attention that suggested he had nowhere else to be and nothing to hide. She spoke his name, the full legal name from his driver's license and birth certificate and marriage license and decades of documentation, and watched carefully for recognition. His expression remained neutral, polite, mildly curious. He didn't react the way someone might who suddenly remembered a forgotten identity, no flash of recognition or confusion or denial. He reacted the way someone might who hears a stranger's name read from a phone book, acknowledging the sound without claiming ownership. She asked if the name meant anything to him. He said he wasn't sure, which seemed to be his default response to questions about identity and history. Not a refusal exactly, more like an honest report from someone standing outside his own life. She asked about gardening, about roses specifically, about gloves mended with brown thread, about a wife and children, about a life in a subdivision where sprinklers ticked across lawns in early summer, and neighbors knew each other's business. She described the house, the street, the town. She mentioned grandchildren, the postal service, retirement plans. He listened with what seemed like genuine effort to retrieve something just out of reach, concentration visible in the slight furrow between his eyebrows, but ultimately shook his head. Some of it felt familiar, he said. The way dreams do when you wake. Edges of scenes that might be memories, or might be constructed from wanting to remember, or might be entirely imagined. He apologized for not being able to offer more, an apology that seemed rehearsed from countless similar conversations where he'd failed to produce expected information. The detective thanked him, assured him no one was in trouble and no one was accusing him of anything, explained that she needed to make some calls and would be in touch soon. She stepped outside into the hallway, where institutional lighting buzzed overhead, and the smell of industrial cleaner competed with the smell of too many people living in too little space. She called her supervisor, briefed him on the situation, received authorization to proceed with family notification. Then she called the number listed in the file for his wife, aware she was about to detonate someone's carefully reconstructed world. The conversation happened by phone first, the detective preferring to prepare her emotionally before showing up at her door with news that might register as miracle or cruelty, depending entirely on perspective and expectations built over 15 years. She explained carefully that a man matching his description and fingerprints had been located in a shelter system 4 states away. That he appeared to be in good physical health but struggled significantly with memory and identity, unable to recall his past with any reliability. That he'd been living as essentially a John Doe for an unknown period. That they couldn't compel him to do anything. He wasn't under arrest, hadn't committed crimes, was free to make his own choices. But if the family wanted contact, it could be arranged carefully and incrementally, with support structures in place to manage what would inevitably be a complicated and emotionally overwhelming reunion. There was a long silence on the line, not empty, but filled with processing. 15 years of grief and adaptation and hard-won acceptance suddenly destabilized, the ground shifting beneath carefully established equilibrium. When his wife finally spoke, her voice was steady but barely, control maintained through sheer will. She said yes. Yes, she wanted to see him. Even if he didn't remember her or their life together. Even if it complicated everything she'd built around his absence. Even if it opened wounds that had finally, painfully, started to close. Yes. The detective made arrangements, coordinating with the shelter, with local mental health services, with family members who would need support navigating reunion, that couldn't possibly meet anyone's fantasies about how these stories should end. The reunion was staged in a neutral location, a supervised visitation room in a family services building, the kind of space typically used for custody exchanges and supervised parent-child contacts in situations where safety or stability was in question. The room tried hard to be welcoming, furnished with comfortable seating that didn't look institutional, soft lighting instead of fluorescent glare, a table with magazines no one ever read, windows with curtains that could be closed for privacy. It occupied a middle ground between clinical and domestic, belonging fully to neither category. His wife traveled with her daughter and son, the three of them navigating an airport and rental car and hotel in a city none of them had visited before, moving through unfamiliar geography to reclaim someone who was himself unfamiliar now. The detective met them in the building's lobby, a space that felt like every other lobby in buildings dedicated to social services. Institutional carpet, uncomfortable chairs arranged in rows, posters on walls about resources and rights, a reception desk staffed by someone whose professional warmth couldn't quite overcome the environment's underlying sadness. She briefed them again on what to expect, walking through scenarios and managing expectations with care born from training and basic human compassion. Memory doesn't always return in neat revelations, she reminded them. Sometimes it stays fractured permanently. Sometimes a person can be physically present but emotionally and cognitively unreachable. And that absence within presence can be harder to navigate than complete loss. Sometimes families found that reunion created new grief rather than resolving old grief. That having someone back in a form you don't recognize felt worse than mourning someone gone. She didn't want them unprepared for hardest possibilities. When he entered the room through a side door accompanied by a social worker, his wife stood automatically, muscle memory from decades of greeting him. For a long moment that stretched beyond comfortable duration, no one spoke. Everyone just looked, taking inventory, comparing present reality against memories and photographs and internalized images built from absence. He'd aged in ways both predictable and startling, gravity and time doing their inevitable work, leaving him looking both familiar and foreign. She said his name softly, the syllables shaped by decades of speaking it in every emotional register. Affection, frustration, fear, grief. He nodded, as though acknowledging the name belonged to him even if it didn't resonate with internal recognition. She asked if he remembered the roses, the gardening gloves with the mended thumb, the Saturday morning he'd left to buy fence staples and never returned. He shook his head slowly, apologetic in a way that suggested he'd disappointed people with this answer before. She reached into her purse, a leather bag she'd carried for years, worn soft at the corners, and pulled out the gloves. She'd kept them all these years through multiple moves and life reorganizations, unable to discard something that still carried the shape of his hands, the impression of fingers that had gripped tools and turned soil and touched her face on their wedding day. She held them out across the space between them. He took them carefully, turned them over, examined the clumsy stitching on the thumb with focused attention. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but present enough that everyone in the room held their breath. Not recognition exactly, not the sudden flood of memory that movies promise. More like a door opening just a crack, letting in a sliver of light that might be memory, or might be the idea of memory, or might be nothing more than the human brain's desperate attempt to construct meaning from objects and context. He asked if he'd been the one to mend them, his voice uncertain. She said yes. He'd done it at the kitchen table one October evening, thread looped through a needle too many times, pulling the seam tight enough to hold, but leaving it puckered and irregular. He'd been frustrated with himself, she remembered, muttering about how he should have just bought new gloves instead of wasting an hour on repairs. But he'd finished the job anyway with stubborn determination, worn them the next day while planting spring bulbs, proud of having fixed something with his own hands. He held the gloves for a long time, running his thumb along the mended seam repeatedly as though the texture might unlock something. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he couldn't fully name. He said he was sorry. Sorry for whatever had happened that left him unable to remember. Sorry for the years lost to all of them. Sorry for standing here now as a stranger wearing his own face, occupying his own body while being fundamentally absent from the history that should have made him who he was. His wife crossed the small distance between them, 3 steps that felt like crossing a continent, and took his hands, the gloves pressed between their palms. She said sorry wasn't necessary or even appropriate, that having him back in any form, even this confusing, incomplete form, was more than she'd allowed herself to hope for in over a decade. That she'd rather have him here, present but unreachable, than continue living with complete absence. Their children stood nearby, wanting to embrace him, but uncertain how to approach a father who didn't remember raising them, who couldn't recall their births or childhoods, or any of the accumulated moments that built family identity. The moment held the weight of 15 years compressed into a room that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning solution, a neutral space where endings and beginnings existed simultaneously without clean resolution. They sat eventually, talking in careful increments about nothing important, the weather, the city, neutral topics that didn't require shared history. The social worker stayed present, monitoring for signs of distress, ready to intervene if the reunion proved too overwhelming for anyone involved. The aftermath unfolded in careful increments over months, each step requiring negotiation between what the family wanted and what he could reasonably manage. Legally, he'd never committed a crime. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no abandonment charges that could be filed against someone who appeared to have experienced a dissociative fugue, a rare but documented psychological phenomenon where individuals lose access to personal identity and history, sometimes wandering for years in a state of functional amnesia triggered by trauma or overwhelming psychological stress. Medical evaluations at a university hospital confirmed he had no degenerative neurological conditions, no tumors, no evidence of stroke, no Alzheimer's markers. His cognitive function, aside from the autobiographical memory loss, remained remarkably intact. He could learn new information, solve problems, engage in complex reasoning. The gaps were specific and selective, as though someone had surgically removed entire chapters of his life story while leaving the mechanics of language and daily function completely undisturbed. A neuropsychologist who specialized in trauma and memory disorders explained that dissociative fugue could be triggered by stressors invisible to outside observers, an accumulation of anxieties that reached critical mass, a moment of overwhelming emotional pressure that the psyche couldn't process, sometimes nothing more dramatic than an intrusive thought at precisely the wrong psychological moment. The brain, in response, protects itself through radical means, severing access to identity entirely. The person continues functioning in the world, finds food and shelter, navigates social interactions, performs basic tasks, but does so without the narrative thread that makes us recognizable to ourselves and others. Reunification therapy would help, she said, establishing rapport and potentially recovering fragments, but expectations needed to be realistic and flexible. Some memory might return in pieces over years. Much of it might never return at all. Some patients experienced their previous life as something that had happened to a different person, able to know it intellectually without feeling it emotionally. The family would need support navigating their own grief, because reunion without recognition created a unique kind of loss that was in some ways harder than death's finality. They brought him back to their home state, though not immediately to environments saturated with history. The original house had been sold years earlier, its rooms now holding other families' memories. Instead, He stayed with his son in a quiet neighborhood where no history pressed against him demanding response. He occupied the guest room, a neutral space decorated with generic art and furniture that belonged to no particular story. His wife visited daily, sometimes staying for hours, bringing photographs and objects from storage. A fishing lure from his old tackle box, a coffee mug he'd favored with a postal service logo faded from years of use, a sweater that still somehow carried his scent despite years in a box. Sometimes he'd hold these items and say they felt right, familiar in a way that didn't translate to actual memory, but suggested some deeper recognition below conscious access. Other times he'd shake his head, apologetic again, unable to find the connection she was offering. His grandchildren, now young adults building their own lives, approached him with mixture of curiosity and caution. The youngest had been 5 when he vanished. She had no independent memories of him, only stories repeated so often they'd calcified into something resembling recollection. The oldest had been 15, old enough to feel the fracture acutely, to carry resentment alongside grief for the years he'd missed. Her high school graduation, her college acceptance, her wedding where his absence had left a hole no one could fill. She asked him once, during an awkward family dinner where everyone tried too hard to act normal, if leaving had been a choice. If some part of him had wanted to disappear. He answered with painful honesty. He didn't know. The not knowing was its own kind of burden, heavier in some ways than definitive answers would have been. She had to make peace with that ambiguity, learning that closure sometimes meant accepting that some questions live without resolution forever. Financial and legal complications required months of patient bureaucratic navigation. His Social Security benefits had continued accumulating in an account no one had touched, creating a strange windfall accompanied by complex paperwork. The Postal Service pension needed reactivation, requiring affidavits from multiple sources, confirming his identity, despite the memory loss. He had no driver's license, no current identification, no employment history for the missing 15 years that could be documented or verified. Rebuilding the administrative scaffolding of modern citizenship, the documents and records that allow someone to exist officially in contemporary society, took patience from overworked clerks, navigating situations outside standard protocol. The question everyone asked, sometimes aloud but more often in the privacy of their own thoughts, was what had happened during those 15 years. Where had he been? How had he survived? The shelter records showed he'd been there intermittently for 18 months, but before that, the trail dissolved into speculation and fragments. He remembered pieces when prompted, sleeping outdoors in urban parks and rural areas, sometimes in abandoned structures that offered basic shelter from weather. Working odd jobs that paid cash under the table, dishwashing at restaurants that didn't ask questions, warehouse unloading for day labor operations, agricultural work during harvest seasons, moving frequently, though he couldn't articulate why or toward what destination. He never felt lost, he said, because feeling lost required knowing you were supposed to be somewhere else. He'd simply existed in an extended present tense, each day unmoored from yesterday or tomorrow, without anxiety about the past or future, because neither category held meaning. It sounded almost peaceful when he described it, which disturbed his family more than if he'd reported suffering. A private investigator hired by the family to fill in gaps traced partial threads through transient communities and day labor networks across multiple states. A homeless outreach worker in one city remembered a man matching his description who'd helped organize donations at a church but never talked about himself. A restaurant manager recalled hiring someone for 6 weeks of dish duty who'd been reliable and quiet, then stopped showing up without notice. A farmer remembered a seasonal worker who'd slept in the barn and worked efficiently, but spoke to no one. These glimpses offered pieces of a mosaic without a coherent whole, like trying to reconstruct a book from scattered pages found in different rooms, each page legible but the overall narrative permanently disrupted. Therapy became a regular fixture, individual sessions for him with a trauma specialist, and family counseling to navigate the strange terrain of reunion without full recognition. His therapist framed the work not as trying to retrieve what was lost, which might never happen, but as building something new from the present foundation, helping him construct an identity that incorporated his past even if he couldn't remember it. Learning to accept the story of his life as told by others, even if it felt secondhand. His wife struggled with this reframing. She wanted her husband back, the specific person she'd loved for decades, not a simulacrum who wore his face but lacked their shared history. But over months of patient work, she began finding moments of connection that didn't rely on memory. Conversations over morning coffee that felt genuine despite not referencing the past. Walks through parks where they moved in comfortable silence. A cautious companionship that might not be what they'd had but was still something real and valuable. The gardening gloves stayed in a drawer in her home, too potent to display casually but too meaningful to discard entirely. Occasionally he'd take them out during visits and hold them, running his thumb along the mended seam in a gesture that had become meditative. Once, while doing this, he said he could almost remember the kitchen table where he'd sewn the stitches. Almost see the light coming through the window behind him. Almost feel the frustration of the thread knotting and having to start over. But almost wasn't quite enough to solidify into full memory. And the moment would slip away, leaving him holding the gloves and shaking his head at his own inability to cross the final distance between knowing and remembering. By the end of the first year back, a rhythm had established itself that everyone could live with, even if no one would call it ideal. He lived in a small apartment downtown, close enough to family for regular visits, but with enough independence that he didn't feel suffocated by their expectations and hopes pressing against him constantly. He volunteered at a community garden, finding solace in physical work and the simplicity of tasks that didn't require explaining himself or managing others' emotions about his presence. Plants didn't care about missing years or lost memory. Soil responded to care in the present tense, rewarding attention without demanding backstory. His wife joined him at the garden sometimes, working side by side in companionable silence that felt more honest than conversations weighted with efforts to bridge the unbridgeable. They developed their own new rituals. Saturday morning coffee at a cafe neither had been to before. Walks along a river trail that held no memories for either of them. Small routines built from scratch that belonged to who they were now rather than who they'd been. The story drew attention inevitably, despite the family's attempts at privacy. A local journalist wrote a piece that got picked up regionally, then nationally, the narrative proving irresistible in its combination of mystery and imperfect resolution. Television producers reached out angling for interviews, seeing commercial potential in reunion stories even when they didn't end neatly. The family declined most requests, protective of privacy they'd fought too hard to rebuild. But they agreed to one carefully controlled interview for a documentary series on missing persons, framed as advocacy rather than spectacle. They wanted people to know that missing doesn't always mean dead. That databases and fingerprint systems and persistent social workers sometimes pull people back from edges no one knew they'd wandered toward. That recovery doesn't always look like reunion in its fullest sense, but can still hold profound meaning and value. His wife spoke on camera about the gardening gloves, about keeping them through multiple moves and life changes, because throwing them away felt like giving up, while keeping them felt like holding space for hope that seemed impossible, but proved not to be. She talked about the strange mercy of having him physically present, even if the person who remembered their wedding, their children's births, 38 years of shared meals and arguments and ordinary moments, was inaccessible behind a neurological barrier neither of them had chosen. She said she'd learned to grieve and be grateful simultaneously, to hold both the loss and the return without needing them to cancel each other out or resolve into single coherent emotion. Years later, small breakthroughs would occur, moments where he'd recall a detail unprompted, like the name of a neighbor's dog from decades ago or the color of curtains in their old bedroom. These fragments arrived without context or explanation, puzzle pieces from a box with no picture on the lid to guide assembly. But each one was offered like a gift, shared with family who received them with disproportionate joy because even pieces meant something. Meant the door between past and present wasn't entirely sealed. Meant that somewhere in the architecture of his mind, the life he'd lived still existed, even if he couldn't fully access it. The case itself became part of training materials for law enforcement agencies and social service organizations. A reminder that missing person files shouldn't close prematurely, that fingerprint databases serve purposes beyond criminal justice, that memory and identity are more fragile than we typically acknowledge. The detective who'd coordinated his identification and return gave talks at conferences, using his case to illustrate the importance of persistent documentation and interagency cooperation. She kept a photograph of him on a bulletin board in her office. Not the missing person flyer from 1988 with its desperate plea for information, but a recent one taken at the community garden, showing him pruning roses with careful attention to the task at hand. The epilogue to this story isn't tidy closure or miraculous restoration. It's ongoing adjustment, continuous recalibration, and hard-won acceptance that some questions will live without answers, and that's not failure. It's simply the shape this particular story takes. His wife, now in her 80s, says she's made peace with ambiguity in ways she never imagined possible when he first disappeared. Their children have built relationships with a father who's simultaneously new and familiar, learning to appreciate what they have rather than mourning what they lost. His grandchildren, some now with children of their own, tell their kids about the grandfather who went away and came back different, turning it into a family story that holds lessons about resilience and the unpredictable nature of human experience. For families navigating similar situations, loved ones missing for years, hope dimmed but never fully extinguished, his case offers practical guidance. Keep DNA and dental records updated in law enforcement databases. Maintain periodic communication with cold case units even when investigations seem dormant, because new technologies emerge and old cases get reviewed. Support organizations that work with unsheltered populations, because sometimes the missing aren't hiding but simply existing in parallel tracks, invisible to systems designed to trace them. Understand that reunification may not look like restoration, and that's not failure. It's simply the shape recovery sometimes takes when time and trauma have done their work. Advocacy organizations that helped coordinate his return now use his story in their outreach, showing that resolution can come decades later through patient documentation and technological advancement. They emphasize the importance of never removing entries from databases, because fingerprints don't expire and DNA remains constant even when everything else changes. They train social workers to look carefully at long-term shelter residents who seem disconnected from identity, to ask gentle questions and consider that amnesia and dissociation explain more cases than most people realize. He still works in the community garden most mornings when weather permits, still wears gloves when he prunes roses. Not the mended ones. Those stay in the drawer at his wife's house, a talisman of a life he can't remember but accepts belong to him. New gloves, practical and unremarkable, that serve present purposes without carrying symbolic weight. His wife joins him there several times a week, and they work side by side, talking about the weather, the plants, what to have for dinner, plans for the weekend. Conversations unweighted by history, sufficient unto themselves in ways that feel like grace when she lets them. On good days, that's enough. On hard days when she looks at him and sees both the man she married and a stranger wearing his face, it still has to be enough because it's all they have. And in the space between those extremes, they've learned to build something that honors both the person he was and the person he's become, holding the paradox gently without demanding it resolve into something simpler or more comfortable. The final image of this story isn't dramatic revelation or miraculous memory restoration. It's two elderly people in a garden on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The man deadheading spent blooms with practiced efficiency, while the woman waters seedlings that will flower in weeks to come. Both of them moving through routines that create continuity, even in the absence of complete understanding. The light angles through leaves the way it does in early summer, casting dappled shadows that shift with the breeze. Somewhere in the soil and the silence and the small, unremarkable tasks that fill days, there's meaning enough. There's presence instead of absence. There's the stubborn, quiet victory of still being here, whatever form that takes, after everything tried to erase him from existence. And maybe, after all the searches and databases and decades of questions without answers, that's the story worth telling. Not the mystery of where he went or exactly why, but the persistence that brought him back. The systems that worked eventually. The family that rebuilt around impossibility. The ordinary miracle of someone lost being found, even if the finding looks nothing like anyone imagined. The gloves stay in their drawer, mended stitches holding after all these years, a small testament to repair that endures even when memory doesn't. And that, finally, feels like enough.